upon this. It was not in the public domain. I did not have to legislate or think about it or give you the punishment, right? But now that you've made it public, I must. So the idea of this, as I'm saying, private role was huge, and it remains to be huge with Islamic conceptualization of what law would say. And so the idea of privacy, right, and now getting to the healthcare context, or even, let me share one further thing. So the idea of backbiting sin is upon both the listener and the one who speaks, right? So the idea that you can't even be in this construct. You should not make things open in public sphere that are related to one another, to society, relations between each other. So how does it relate to the medical care context? So here, in terms of privacy, in all the Islamic medical codes of ethics, and within the doctrine of what the patient's and the physician responsibility to each other is, there's this idea of that everything that is within the physician's space is a trust given to him or her, right? So there, in that context, the patient, and this resonates again with other traditions, is disclosing something that he might not or she might not to another, and so everything is entrusted upon you. And if you are a believer, those trusts must remain secret, right? This can be extended to health data, and now you can think about de-identification. But if the idea, if the primary way of framing of all of this is in terms of a trust, then you can introduce protections upon it, right? But it would be a different type of protections than we think about today. Not one rooted in this idea of self-determination, but rather upon what is a trust upon society and individuals. So I will end with this, and I said we can get to this in the Q&A. There are two assumptions that I've heard today around the questions of privacy and why, the conference has the value of health data versus privacy, how the conflict can be resolved. And it seems to me that there is a clear worry about the social ramifications of data that might or may not be able to be, but there, as today we just spoke about, there might be a way to identify that individual. That we're actually worried about social ramifications. So if someone has AIDS, they will find out. If someone has the example earlier was addiction to something, someone will find out. And this is very problematic because the individual might then be therefore discriminated against, right? Or in the case of patients, if people don't want to disclose something, and someone finds out, they might have to pay higher insurance premiums and things like of that nature. Perhaps the reason that our society is so worried about this privacy, and I'm not saying it's the only reason, is because of the social degradation of our society. Right? So medical physicians, we learn medical ethics in a potentially 2 or 4 week seminar in medical school, second year. And then all we learn is practice. After that is the Aristotelian modeling of people. Perhaps our models of moral character aren't so good in medicine or in research. And therefore, since we do not get moral formation within that, there's a clear question of the public or what physicians or other researchers are going to do. So I'll end with that note, but here's where maybe moral traditions might have something to say about how you form individuals to be virtuous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Padela, for highlighting some of my confusion regarding the sources of moral systems, including Islamic law, but also for clarifying something that's very unique within your realm, that concept of public space versus private space. We're going to move forward with Reverend J. Michael Little, who is a Christian minister, legal advocate, and social philosopher in Washington, D.C. He's an honors graduate from Morehouse College. He holds advanced degrees in theology from Princeton and Virginia Union Universities, and a law degree from Georgetown Law Center. Good choice. He currently serves as senior pastor of Friendship Baptist Church here in D.C. He's also founding president and executive director of Jeremiah's Circle of Friends Legal Clinic and Outreach Center, and director of community relations at the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia.
Good evening. Let me just give you all a caveat. In any context where religion is discussed, you can always tell which religionist is a Baptist because he'll be the one who will take a biblical text. And so I just hope that I don't end up preaching, but I do intend to look at a biblical text. I'm gratified by being on this panel with such distinguished interlocutors and with an audience such as yourself. Thank you, Dr. Molina. Let me just say, if you don't know what a Baptist is, you must be from out of town or something. do know what a Baptist is, I wish you'd tell me, because the range is so wide as to who practices the Baptist variety of Christian faith. We are from the one extreme, very, very conservative religious folks, and then we have some of the most liberal religionists anywhere in our camp, just a wide array of folk who call themselves Baptist Christians. And I guess the only glue that could be said to hold us together is what we call the four freedoms. Baptists are absolutely adamant about religious freedom, about the freedom to worship as we please, to interpret our understanding of God as we please, in what location we please, with or without hierarchy. So we're just all over the map in every respect. We have what we call Bible freedom. Every individual Baptist can interpret the Bible for him or herself. We have soul freedom. That is to say, we are free to make our moral choices based on our understanding of what God is calling us to do. We have church freedom. That is to say, there is no large body that controls the church. Each individual church is an entity unto itself. And then we have religious freedom. And that is just the freedom to practice religion with or without whatever creeds or overarching guidelines that might be imposed upon us. And so the key to understanding Baptist is simply freedom. And of course that leads me to the particular spin on what privacy is, that says it is to be let alone. I know that there is some confusion, not confusion, but varying definitions of privacy. But I guess the two main ones would be the interest in concealment of information, as we're discussing here, and sees privacy as being violated whenever private information is obtained against the wishes of the person to whom the information pertains. And then another privacy interest, I guess the other large privacy interest would be the interest in being left alone. And that's invaded when you get an unwanted caller or an unwanted visitor or a shouted obscenity or just the intruder upon one's space. And the latter, the privacy interest of being let alone, is the one that I want to try to talk about a little bit as it relates to the Baptist understanding. As I understand, I gather in here today, and this is the first time I've ever done anything like this. But I think we are trying to talk about what type of privacy ought to be protected and whether a ground might be found for creating such a zone of protection in the solemn confines of religious understanding. And I want to say that there is no theology of privacy as such in the Christian faith. You'd be hard-pressed to find any systematic, thoroughly articulated understanding of relationship between privacy and the Christian faith. But I think we might begin with our conception of God as being totally other. We can start there. There is a uniqueness and an apartness and an unapproachableness in God that's a given. And then we could look at also the God who creates humankind, imago Dei, that is in the image of God. And in that creation in God's image, there is an inherent uniqueness and dignity that is ascribed to humankind. And then there is this fact that God is known only to those whom God reveals God's self, so that you cannot spy on God and learn different aspects of his nature, but you know God when God chooses to share God's self, and that's revelation. And then the point I want to try to elucidate just a bit, ours is a God who lets us alone. God who lets us alone. You'll probably know it's been about 125 years now since Brandeis and Warren did that famous article, The Right to Privacy, arguing for the legal recognition of a right to privacy, and they defined it as the right to be let alone. And that's probably one of the most famous articles in history in the annals of law. And this conception of privacy as the right to be let alone influenced law in the states. Legislature started developing laws of privacy, and the courts started to carve out this niche for right to privacy. And just a year after that article by Brandeis and Warren, the Supreme Court in Union Pacific v. Wofford, I think it was, referred to this right to be let alone, and held that a court couldn't force a plaintiff in a civil case to submit to a surgical examination. Then, of course, nearly 40 years later, when he was a justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Brandeis wrote his famous dissent in Olmstead, and that was the case where the court held that wiretapping was not a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and then Brandeis fired off his statement that every individual has a right over against the government to be left alone. But I wanted to say that understanding of privacy as a right to be let alone was not original to Warren, it was not original to Brandeis. Some trace it to Judge Cooley in his famous treaty on torts, when Cooley, he had the right to be let alone, explaining that physical touching was a tort because every individual had the right to be let alone. And I think that was where Brandeis and Warren cribbed the phrase in their great argument. But I want to say that I've traced this fundamental understanding of privacy even beyond Cooley. And I trace it all the way back to the prophet Hosea in the Old Testament of the Bible. And beyond Hosea, I can take it back into time, beyond time, into eternity, to God himself. Because we find Hosea, one of the four great prophets of the 8th century BCE, doing what the late Rabbi Abraham Heschel said all prophets do, and that is speak for God in an octave too high. And that is, Hosea comes along and says that through him God is speaking. And he's in the 4th chapter of Hosea, he's talking about God's chosen people, and he says that he's led them out of Egypt these long years and brought them through the desert and given them a fair land and a kingdom, and now they have repaid him by running off after other gods. And so one day God is represented by Hosea saying, quite hopelessly and finally, Israel or Ephraim has chased after idols, let him alone. And God, speaking of Ephraim as a whole nation, is saying, let him alone. Do not go, do not intrude, do not pry, do not probe, let him alone. And that set me to thinking that in my own experience, there have been days and weeks and months and sometimes even longer where I felt that God has left me alone, even when I didn't want to be left alone, but as though God would not intrude unless God were called upon. And I would say that you haven't even begun to understand anything about the Christian conception of God until you realize that God, in the most disconcerting way, stays out of sight, is apart from us unless invited. You can search the biblical record and find it all over the place. Jacob wrestled one night with somebody on the bank of a river, and the person with whom Jacob wrestled said, let me go for the day breaketh. And God is like that. God is ready to be alone and away and apart, not held and embraced. And then we find later on even Christ upon the tree saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He is left alone. And we hear David in the Psalms over and over again saying, people come by me daily in my turmoil saying, where is thy God? Be silent, be not silent. Lest if thou be silent, I become like them that go down to the pit. And then Isaiah shakes his head in mystery, saying, verily, thou art a God that hidest thyself. And so God leaves us in our privacy. For good or ill, God leaves us undisturbed unless invited. And so we've got to deal with that. We've got to at least face it. And I suppose that many of you, there have been hours without number where we have wanted some clear, intimate showing of God. But God stays just outside the door, allowing us the space that he created us with. We pray sometimes that God would intrude, and only then does God enter. There have been so many moments when we have said, if God would just do something, anything, show up, make some noise, show some sign. But God is a part of allowing us our space. From this, we draw this inviolable space that every created being has, such that not even God will intrude in this intimate zone unless called upon, unless invited. So this is where we draw our sense, if it could be called a theology of privacy. There is an intimacy that is I would not call it right, but an inherent part of the being of every person God has created that cannot be violated. And I would argue, and I think it would probably be understood in our church, that zone is violated when someone's health, a very intimate aspect of a person's being, is handled, or the record of one's health is handled by others. And while I would hasten to say that every Baptist is free to let their health records be seen or not, to make their own moral choice as to how their information would be handled, apart from ministers, apart from clergy, apart from anyone, I think our understanding is that privacy is inviolable, or should be inviolable, because not even God would intrude upon us. And so Baptists, with our great emphasis on freedom, are very individual about how we approach pretty much everything, but certainly how we handle our private life. I would say most would say, by all means, I should be the one to determine what happens, since not even God would violate my space unless God were called upon. So hopefully that gives you some sense that we don't have rules handed down. Perhaps we should have more guidelines in terms of how we should handle ourselves in this type of situation. But we give our people a sense that God calls you to be free, and you will not be exempted from the hard choices that come from deciding what to do in circumstances like this, these issues of medical privacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend, for highlighting and reminding us about the difficulties of finding the legal sources for privacy and the even more difficult theological sources for privacy. Quite honestly, I think that privacy is one of those values that we really don't recognize that much when we have them. We certainly recognize them when we lose them. And that would be the case when your identity is first stolen, or somebody finds information about you that you don't believe they should be having possession of. I'm going to open up for questions from the audience, but before I do that, to give you the opportunity to think carefully about questions for our panelists, I'm going to ask the first question myself, giving you plenty of time for that. And mine has to do with your respective traditions. In those are patients morally entitled to decide what information about themselves they share with or withhold from medical practitioners, family members, religious leaders, or others. So feel free to go at it in whatever order you prefer. So, somebody has to answer to it.
I think this one's a tough one because it's not black or white from spiritual point of view. Because I think that obviously we want to give patients as much control over their records as possible because of the misuse, and also because we want to empower people. On the other hand, it's not black or white because, for example, in the field I was in prior to this, if a mother did not share that she had HIV, for example, then that affected the fetus's health and possibility for treatment for the fetus. So I can't answer it in a black or white way. It would have to be in the context of the situation. And then, as I said earlier when I was talking, we would reflect on our motivation. It's guiding us, our virtuous intentions to benefit both ourselves and others. I couldn't answer it as yes in all cases. The person, you know, and I guess this is the, I would defer to the law and say that you have the tougher end of the stick.
So I think that what's interesting, so again, the rights-based language is a bit interesting to reflect on. But I think that the idea, the caricature of that, so of course, if patients disclose things to me as a physician or to their physicians or whatever else it is, as they please, right? So the question isn't whether, I think the question is, if you're saying that, is there a right to do that? Patients do that, that's the common way that things happen, right? People don't tell you. I know residents of mine say, how can we find that out? I didn't find that out. Well, they didn't tell you. I mean, they told me. I don't know. I mean, right? It's because patients change their stories or disclose different information to different individuals. And that's why we emphasize trying to get patient trust in medical school. So, but let me give you, so I think that you're asking about the status quo and does people have rights to do that? That's, it's kind of difficult to say there would be another model to do that, because if physicians were able to get information through other means aside from the patient, then maybe you can think about, well, which means should I use primarily and which I should use secondarily? But at this point, most of what we have is through patients self-reporting. But let me give you an instance. So an Islamic Juridical Council, I believe in India, was talking about confidentiality, and they were talking about times when the Muslim physician ought to break confidentiality and when they're permitted to break confidentiality. So they're different, right? When you have to, right, legally, you should break confidentiality, and then when you can or cannot. And one of them was very interesting. And so one of the case examples was where a physician should, right, ought to, it's recommended that they do. So this is a legal sort of obligation to give information that a patient has given to them that proves that they didn't commit a crime. Now think about that. We're talking about an individual, right, who might, for whatever reason, take upon themselves a penalty for some other reason. But here, the idea is that there should be some sort of justice here. And the physician has privileged information. And for the benefit of that individual, you should disclose that, even if the individual doesn't want you to disclose that. So, and on the other examples, which is more, right, that was talked about, was in the case of now individual benefit and then communal benefit, right? So here, the disclosing of certain types of communicable diseases. So what I think is interesting is here, when you have that trust of a patient telling you certain things, right? When can you break that, when you can, you not? And I think that's an interesting sort of scenario. What meets the bar of breaking confidentiality, and where you have to versus what you can, where you can? We can entertain that discussion, but I just want to reformulate the question.
Okay. I'll say again that under no circumstance would a Baptist minister violate confidentiality. What is expressed about the condition of one's soul is between God and that person. And if it is shared with a third party, such as a minister, it remains between God and that person. And it is almost as though the Christian minister never heard it for purposes of revealing it to anyone else. The key, again, is freedom, and any use of that which is intimate to a person's soul, as again, I think health concerns are. Any type of expression of the conditions of a person's body, which is connected to the soul, must be by way of confession. Anything else is coercion and is morally inappropriate. So any Christian at any time is free to deny information about himself, about herself, to any third party as regards their health. I was very greatly concerned reading the other day about Jesse Jackson Jr., former Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., who had various health concerns and was seen at a conference recently and was bombarded by the media who were pretty much asserting that he having been a public servant, they essentially had the right to know his present medical condition and how things were going along. And so the question becomes, when we go to a specific social function, do we lose the dignity of soul? Do we thereby cede the right to our intimates, which not even God would intrude upon, to the public? And I think the answer is a resounding no. I think that any Baptist that I know would go to hell fighting about their private information being forcefully or being taken from them in any coercive way. So, yeah, each individual has the right to simply say no to yielding that type of information.
Thank you. I wonder if anybody in the audience would like to volunteer a question? Yes, go ahead, please.
So, I work in mental health and substance abuse, and so spirituality is a huge, huge growing area of interest in that body of work, I think. And so that's why I'm here today, and it's very interesting to hear about some of the differences. And I think I grasped the intentionality issue in Buddhism, so I've got that in terms of privacy and how to think about that, and also in terms of patient-centered care and some of the things that we're focused on. I certainly got a very clear message about the Baptist religion and how you view that, and I thought the Jesse Jackson example is a very interesting one, given that it's been so exposed. He's been so exposed in the media already, and we actually have a little, in Connecticut, we have a little bit of a movement about trying to get people like that to talk about their lived experience, because we think it helps people feel not so discriminated against, but it's up to the person. And so I would agree with you. But as I listened to you talking about the writings of the and that sort of what's in there sort of dictates people's, and maybe that's too strong a word, but influences people's behavior. Given when it was written, and that there's been so many changes in the modern world, I'm trying to understand if there is something in that would inform people about the way they should respond to questions about their physical health, and also how you talked about when you should and shouldn't disclose. And it sounds like you're really, the way you're thinking about it is a risk benefits or a risk. And so we do a lot of forensic work, so the example you used about when somebody is saying they've done something and they haven't, and the psychiatrist may have that information, would we share it? And I'm not actually sure about that, but I'm going back to, is there writing in your scripture that speaks to the issue of that we're talking about?
Good, so that gives me a chance to clarify. So you know, our sacred text is the Quran, you know, that we believe is the literal word of God.